Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are looking today at Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. I'm going to start in about 45 seconds. I am live today. So those of you who are tuning in on the video recording of this, skip ahead about 30 seconds or so, and you'll see where I begin. So I'll return to the main topic in just a few seconds. But again, it's Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. Okay, let's start. Once again, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study, Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. It's a healing story that takes place on the Sabbath, which makes it interesting to look at. And I'm going to start with the first of the three P's, which is prayer. And this is the prayer of St. Francis, which I know many of you are familiar with. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Okay, the second of the three P's is perspective. And as you know, I'm working my way through a sermon series titled The Good Life and looking at various topics each Sunday. Some of them are directly drawn from whatever the lectionary reading is for that given Sunday. But the last few Sundays, I've kind of been drifting from the lectionary a bit. And I'm doing the same this coming Sunday because the topic is the good life and kindness. And kindness in the Bible is more than just being nice. Kindness goes much deeper, and it really gets into the world of compassion, identifying with the person that you're being kind to. So it's more than just this kind of surfacey thing. It goes much deeper. And there's actually some neuroscience to back up the health benefits of being kind. And this is today's perspective. I want to look at the issue of kindness from the perspective of neuroscience. So I came across an article by Lila Lieberman titled The Neuroscience of Compassion. And what she does in this article is she draws on the research of Stanford neuroscientist James Doty. So here's what she says. She spotlights the work of James Doty, a neuroscientist, who argues that being compassionate or caring for others is our default mode as people. We are wired to care for others, says Doty. So then the question is, why don't we always care for others? Why are we mean to each other? Why aren't we always kind to each other if we're wired to do this? The problem, says Doty, comes with our adrenaline-powered lifestyles. Modern society, he says, has developed much faster than our ability as a species to evolve and respond to it. And so we are under nearly constant stress. This inhibits our ability to respond compassionately and shuts off our natural tendency towards this inherent state. In modern society, says Doty, there is a chronic release at low levels of hormones or proteins that are deleterious to our health. Our nervous system was never meant to be chronically triggered. In fact, one of the greatest causes of a variety of illnesses is the release of inflammatory proteins released in response to stress. And it also results in a decrease in the function or ability of our immune systems to respond to threats. So, Doty says, this is why in today's world we have an epidemic of stress, anxiety, and depression. Our overstimulated nervous systems also make us more reactive and quick to jump to judgments about others. Many of us are in a constant state of stress and anxiety, reducing our capacity for compassion and kindness. And yet, he says, when we do behave compassionately, it has a powerful effect on our bodies, a healing effect. So in his research, he's found that being kind to other people can actually reset our bodies from stress mode to rest mode, causing, he says, all kinds of positive effects to our overall health. Practicing kindness can change our brains, help us process things more clearly, help us make better choices, and it can actually slow down the aging process in our body's cells. Our bodies, says Doty, crave the hormone release we receive from being kind to other people. So he concludes, be kind because it's good for your health. And this actually coheres with something that theologian Bruce Epperly has written. So he says that being kind is one way that we can participate in, quote, God's great work of healing the world. A simple act of kindness, says Epperly, can remind us of the significance of small actions in saving the world. So that's the perspective for today, the good life and kindness. And that brings us to pieces of scripture. And again, we're looking at Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. This is a healing story, but it's an example of Jesus being kind. So starting in verse 9. Jesus left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. He said to the Pharisees, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against Jesus, how to destroy him. That's a very deliberate word that Matthew uses there, destroy him. This is not just about merely killing Jesus. This is about destroying him, destroying his reputation, destroying his following. It's the attempt on their part to undo him, both in the public world and then also, of course, physically, by destroying his body. So there's a context for this Sabbath story in Matthew chapter 12. What Matthew does here in chapter 12, the first part of it, verses 1 through 14, is he strings together two what are called controversy stories, where Jesus goes back and forth with religious leaders, in this case Pharisees, and Matthew presents Jesus as besting these religious leaders in debates over what is permitted on the Sabbath. So in the first story, earlier in chapter 12, Jesus and the disciples were walking through fields of grain, and the disciples began to pluck the heads of the grain and eat them. The Pharisees, again, these are the religious leaders that Jesus is in controversy with in these stories. By the way, there were many groups in first century Judaism. I'll get into this in just a little bit of time, but Pharisees were one among several groups. Some of them constituted religious leadership in early or quote-unquote ancient Judaism. So the Pharisees in this story, the first story in Matthew chapter 12, question Jesus about why he's allowing his disciples to pluck heads of grain and eat them on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees see the plucking of grain as a form of work, and thus a breach of Sabbath law. And remember that if you go back to the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5, and you read the list of the 10 commandments, observing the Sabbath is one of the 10. So this is a big deal. It's one of the top 10 commandments in Judaism. So these Pharisees see what the disciples are doing on the Sabbath as a form of work and thus a breach of Sabbath law. Now, in that story, the first story in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus replies to the Pharisees with two examples from the Hebrew Bible of people who broke Sabbath law, strictly speaking, out of necessity, because they were hungry, for example. So they broke Sabbath law out of necessity, and this wasn't a cataclysmic problem. And why is that? Well, Jesus goes on in that story in Matthew to quote from the prophet Hosea, who says, God desires mercy and not sacrifice. So mercy matters more to God than meticulous religious observance. Or, to put that in Sabbath terms, feeding the belly out of necessity matters more to God than strict observance of Sabbath law. So we could say, and put it into slightly more theological and broader terms, that people matter more to God than religious do's and don'ts. And that's really the principle that emerges from stories like this one. People matter more to God than strict religious observance. So that's the first story, and it sets the context for the story that we just read. The second story, also taking place on a Sabbath. And apparently, the way Matthew tells the story, it seems like it's the very same Sabbath day, although the setting is different. The first story is in the grain fields. The second story, according to Matthew, takes place in the synagogue. Now, Jesus, according to the gospel writers, in particular Luke, made it his quote-unquote custom to go to the synagogue on Sabbath, which implies that Jesus was an observant Jew. He was a faithful Jew going to the synagogue every Sabbath. It was his custom. So while he's inside this synagogue, we're told in verse 10 that a man with a withered hand was there. So that word withered is a word that could be translated as dry, but it's actually a plant word. So it refers to a plant that's so dried up that it has withered. So it's an interesting word that Matthew chooses to use here. And most likely Matthew is borrowing from the Gospel of Mark. But still, it's an interesting word. So this man's hand is withered. It's dried up. It's of no use. It must be some kind of physical condition. We're not quite sure what it is. But at the very least, you could think about the social implications of such a condition. Maybe he was ashamed of it. Maybe people had made fun of him for it. Maybe he was bullied because of it. Or maybe people just shunned him because of it. They didn't know what to do with this man who had only one functioning hand. The Pharisees in verse 10 see an opportunity to trap Jesus. Now, keep in mind, based on that first story in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus has just bested the Pharisees in the grain fields by quoting from Old Testament passages that emphasize mercy over sacrifice. And he's kind of shut their mouths, because what are they going to say to that? But now this is their opportunity to get some vengeance against Jesus. So they point to the man. They draw him up. Maybe they ask him to stand. Who knows? They're using him as an object lesson. They're using him as an object lesson. I want to emphasize that. They're not interested in the man as a human being. They're interested only in his ability to function as an object lesson so that they can trap Jesus. They're not interested in him as a human being. So they point to the man and they ask Jesus whether it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. So their question is basically, is healing a form of work and thus a breach of Sabbath law, which commands rest on the Sabbath? Now, a little bit here about Sabbath law in early Judaism. By early Judaism, I mean the Judaism in 2nd to 1st century BCE, all the way through early 2nd century CE, right in the time period that Jesus is alive, early Judaism. So Sabbath law in early Judaism, of course, it's based on the Ten Commandments. One of the Ten Commandments is the command to observe the Sabbath. But it's also, interestingly, one of only 2 of the 10 commandments that is not a thou shalt not command. So if you're familiar with the Ten Commandments, you know that many of them are thou shalt not. So thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not make any graven images, thou shalt not covet, etc., etc. Two of the positive commands in the Ten Commandments are: one, honor your father and your mother. It's not a thou shalt not command, it's a positive one. Honor your father and your mother. And the second one, Sabbath law. So it's remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then, of course, it goes on to specify not doing work, but the command begins with something positive. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So Sabbath law involves doing something and not just not doing something. It's not a do not steal command. It involves doing something, which is to rest. But then the question is, what do we mean by rest? Now, as I mentioned a second ago, Pharisees were one of several groups in early Judaism, and we know this from a variety of sources, not just written sources produced by these groups, but writers in the ancient world who were writing about these groups. So one of them is the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the last third of the first century. He names various groups in the Judaism of his day. So we have a variety of sources that help us piece together what early Judaism looked like, and it was very diverse, even though most of it was temple-based, located around the central complex of the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, it was observed in a variety of places surrounding the temple, Galilee or whatever, and then, of course, in the diaspora around the Roman world. But fundamentally, it was a temple-based and synagogue-based religion. So if you couldn't get to the temple, you could go to a local synagogue. But of course, if you could get to the temple, you wanted to offer sacrifices there if you could. And Judaism underwent a massive upheaval when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, and the religion transformed into a rabbinic-based religion, which by and large it still is today. So there were a variety of groups in early Judaism under this broad category of Judaism. So there were groups like, of course, Pharisees, but also Sadducees and Essenes. And then there were members of the Qumran group, many of them producing Dead Sea Scrolls. Then there were the priests, and there's a lot of overlap between these various groups. Some of the divisions are very sharp, but some of them are a little bit blurry. In particular, the relationship between the Essenes and the Qumran group, because some of the Essenes wrote some of the scrolls that are part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's not clear whether all of the people in the Qumran group were Essenes. So there's overlap, but there's also some distinction. Now, several of these groups differed on what resting meant on the Sabbath. They had competing interpretations of Sabbath law. So the Essenes, for example, according to the historian Josephus, were quite strict. So resting on the Sabbath for them meant not even lighting a fire to cook with. So if you had to carry wood into your house, if you had to figure out a way to light a flame, all of that stuff would involve effort or work, and thus be a breach of Sabbath law. So you can't even light a fire on the Sabbath. In one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the Damascus document, probably written by the Essenes, it mentions that even speaking about work on the Sabbath was forbidden, as was walking beyond 1,000 cubits from one's home. Food on the ground could not be picked up or water carried. Both of these would be forms of work. You couldn't strike a beast to try to get it to move. That would be a form of work. Servants could not carry children. Perfume could not be worn. Animals fallen into cisterns could not be lifted out, etc., etc. All of these would constitute work and thus a breach of Sabbath law. Now, that last one right there, animals can't be lifted out of cisterns on the Sabbath, that last one connects with today's story, because Jesus answers the Pharisees' question about whether one can heal on the Sabbath by asking them whether they would rescue a sheep if it had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath. The implication, and the reason why he asked them this, is because of what it implies. The implication is that yes, absolutely they would. And in fact, Jesus makes a point here of saying, if you had only one sheep and it fell into a ditch, wouldn't you rescue that sheep? And the implication is that, yes, of course, the Pharisees would do that. The implication is that the Pharisees have a different interpretation of Sabbath law than do, say, the Essenes, who wouldn't allow you necessarily to rescue an animal fallen into a cistern or a ditch or something like that. So the Pharisees have a different viewpoint on what constitutes a breach of Sabbath law. Now, incidentally, there's evidence in early Judaism of groups debating loopholes in Sabbath law. So, for example, if we were to look at the Mishnah is a collection of rabbinic tractates from the 2nd century and a little bit beyond. The Mishnah talks about a Pharisaic tradition of what's called fusion or interweaving of houses to permit carrying a vessel from one house to another house. So the issue at stake was, okay, it's the Sabbath. And if you carry something from your house to your neighbor's house, that constitutes work. So you guys are going over there to eat and you bring a pot of stew. If you're carrying that stew from your house into theirs, that's work and thus a breach of Sabbath law. So you can't do it. So, but is there a loophole? Is there a way to get around this? What happens if the houses are divided by an alley or a courtyard? Is there a loophole that allows you to carry between houses without breaking Sabbath law? And indeed, the Pharisees and the rabbis had come up with such a loophole. So what they said was, if you place doorposts and lintels at the entrances to the alleys and the courtyards, that would transform the entire space with many houses into a single house. It's what's called a legal fiction. Literally, they're different houses, but by means of this legal fiction, they can be treated as if, that's what legal fiction is, as if they were all a single house. Thus, you can carry your pot of stew across the alley or across the courtyard into your neighbor's house and not break Sabbath law. It wouldn't constitute work because the whole complex is viewed as a single house. You've transformed it because of this loophole. So they got pretty clever in the ancient world about ways around some of the strict interpretations of Sabbath law, and in particular, what constituted a breach of Sabbath law and what constituted work. Now, incidentally, the Sadducees, one of the other groups in early Judaism, didn't agree with this use of loopholes, at least with respect to this one about doorposts and lintels. So you have an example of the Sadducees disagreeing with the Pharisees' interpretation of Sabbath law, saying it's not legitimate. But imagine what that leads to. What that leads to is, from the Sadducees' perspective, the Pharisees, who are carrying across the courtyard that they're treating as all a single house, are breaking Sabbath law. Now, that's pretty interesting, because if you read about what happens in the Old Testament to people who break Sabbath law, picking up sticks, for example, on the Sabbath, the penalty is death. But that's not how Jews on the ground in early Judaism treated each other. If you broke, one of the other group members, in your interpretation, broke Sabbath law, it didn't then necessarily lead to you wanting to execute them. You just sort of lived with the different interpretations. They were okay with those interpretations, even though they fought vigorously for their own particular views. So now back to Jesus and this back and forth that he has with the Pharisees over interpreting Sabbath law. So he points out that the Pharisees would indeed rescue a sheep that had fallen into a pit or a ditch. So he's setting them up. He knows that they would rescue the sheep. And once he's made this point, because he knows where they're at, once he makes this point, he set them up for a zinger. So this is what happens in verse 12. So he set them up. Wouldn't you rescue this one sheep? Verse 12, how much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That last bit there is Jesus's operating here as a rabbi, his interpretation of Sabbath law. It kind of supersedes anything else. What supersedes anything else is doing good. If you're called to do good and you're in the circumstances where you can do good, that takes precedence over the meticulous observance of Sabbath law, because doing good is part of the spirit of the law. Now, what Jesus does here by first setting them up, saying, wouldn't you rescue a sheep that's fallen into a ditch? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? That is a standard rabbinic argument from the lesser to the greater. It's called kal vayomer in Hebrew. The lesser to the greater, or the minor to the major, or the light to the heavy. So it's a standard rabbinic argument, the how much more argument. So you would rescue a sheep, right? That's the lesser, that's the light, that's the minor. How much more would you help a human being, or should you help a human being? That's the heavier, that's the major argument. So kal vayomer, how much more? So standard rabbinic argument. And what it is really is a kind of mic drop moment, because what are these Pharisees going to say in response to that? He has put them on the spot. They've agreed to the lesser, the sheep. Then they should agree to the greater, the helping of the human, or the doing good for a fellow human on the Sabbath. How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? And of course, Jesus then proceeds to heal the man. Now, the point is, who cares what day it is? It doesn't matter that it's the Sabbath day. Who cares what day it is? Because being kind to another human being is what matters in the end. It's the true spirit of Jewish law. Jewish law has lots of micro details. Totally fine. Keep observing them. But you can break them, or you can do something that supersedes them if it means being kind or doing good for another human being. And think about what all of this means for the man with the withered hand. Jesus treated him as a human being, a child of God. He was willing to engage in this back and forth, risking his own reputation as a rabbi, to engage in this argument with the Pharisees for the sake of the man. He's willing to put himself on the line for this guy with the withered hand. He comes to his defense in a way, and he helps him. He does good for him. He's kind to him. So he treats the man as worthy of being treated as a human being, and not merely as an object lesson, which is how the Pharisees treated him. They used him as an object lesson. Jesus treats him as a human being. Jesus was kind to the man. So this is why I think the example of Jesus in the Gospels is so powerful and so timeless. Because every day we interact with people who are carrying modern versions of withered hands. Some of them are literal physical ailments that people have, like a literal withered hand. But many of them are invisible burdens, invisible wounds, invisible crosses that people carry. And some of these, or maybe even many of them, cause people shame or grief. So being kind to them is a way to, as theologian Bruce Epperly says, participate in God's great work of healing the world, one person at a time. And what it is really in the end is a way to follow the example of Jesus from this story. He is kind to the man. Okay.